All right. Okay. So now I will be speaking and sharing a bit regarding the occupational carcinogen exposure, and I will be giving a bit of introduction, the background of these exposures, and subsequently I will highlight what is being done within the country, meaning in Malaysia, regarding these exposures. So allow me to start. And for this presentation, I would like to acknowledge Dr. Marzuki, Prof. Nirmala, Prof. Victor, and Dr. Azlan Darus. Dr. Marzuki, Prof. Nirmala and Prof. Victor is actually from University of Malaya, as we all know. And Dr. Azlan Darus is from Social Security Organization. Now, part of my study mainly used up data from SOCSO, their health screening profile data, that we explored further to look into exposures to carcinogen factors among these employees. So basically it's a very vast database, but we managed to have a good cooperation from SOCSO and extract the data to look into exposures among Malaysian employees. So I'm very thankful to UM and I'm very thankful to SOCSO for allowing us to look into their information and further explore on this subject. So allow me to start a bit regarding what is meant by occupational exposure and all that. For those of you, I'm sure today we have participants from various groups, including occupational health doctors, experts, and also medical practitioners. So let me start from the basic a bit, and we can go in further into other details later. When we're talking about occupational exposures, it means that there's presence of substance in the work environment external to the subject. And as we all know, the core bread and butter of occupational health is made up of understanding the hazards. And these hazards are physical hazards, chemical hazards, biological, ergonomic, and psychological agents. Examples of physical hazards like noise, vibration, radiation, lighting. Biological like bacteria, fungi, and ergonomic aspects are like risk factors that comes with manual handling, repetitive movement, restrictive work area, and so on. And then we have chemical exposures at work, meaning that substances that are chemical based but can present in various forms, for example, like fumes, gases, aerosols, mist vapors, and liquids. And when we are talking about exposures, it means that these exposures are something that is above the limit or normal level that is being set from the background level. So when we're talking about background levels, where do we get these measurements? These are basically from studies that have been carried out throughout the years, information that were regularly updated, for example, by the American College of Government Industrial Hygienists, ACGIH, and then in Malaysia, we have our regulations under DOSH and the USH regulations that is also being currently updated. So they have set what are the background levels based on the available informations, and we refer to these particular values when we are saying that there is going to be an exposure more than the limit being set. So this is something that we are looking at objectively, and when we are saying exposure, again, it means that it is more than what is being accepted as tolerable. And having said that, there are certain types of exposures that cannot be very objectively measured. As for example, when you're talking about job stress or when you're talking about certain ergonomical hazards and so on, it has to be from a questionnaire basis or from a subjective approach. But definitely from a scientific point of view, we will be using validated measures and tools to quantify and to mention that these exposures are indeed hazardous to the employees. Okay, so when we are also talking about exposure, we cannot run away from the term of risk. Risk is, as we all know, the formula is hazards times exposure. And there's another element that many academicians have looked into, which is the vulnerability, meaning or the likelihood of these exposures being present, and how much, although the exposure can be very high, but how frequent and how vulnerable are a group of people who are being exposed to these hazards are at risk of developing a certain type of occupational disease. So this is the basic formula, and based on this risk, we come up with the next level of action, which is the control measures. So when you're talking about control measures, again, the most basic is we have to understand the hierarchy of control. So why am I emphasizing from the very beginning about the basic things that some of you may already know and very well versed about is because if you don't get the grasp of this, then it will be very difficult to follow my presentation. So let me start. When you're talking about hierarchy of controls, we're talking about 5 stages. So it's actually an inverted pyramid, meaning that when there's a risk or a hazard and people are being exposed, the best method that we can do is to eliminate. But having said that, not all the substances or work process can be totally eliminated, meaning we physically remove the hazard from the workplace. And the next action would be to substitute, meaning we replace the hazard with something less hazardous. All right. And if that is not possible or cannot be supported with any other control measures, then we can also implement the engineering controls. So let me also highlight that in certain work situations or work processes, not only one particular control measure exists, it can be a combination of many types of control measures. So when talking about engineering controls, it means that we come up with processes or engineering measures, control measures, that we look at the source of the hazard producing source. For example, like noise. When we're talking about noise, we have source reduction, meaning that we modify the machine or so on to reduce the noise exposure. So I'm just giving some analogies for you to understand and grasp what is this hierarchy of control is all about. And other than this, we can also implement administrative controls, which means we change the way people work. For example, we have job rotation, limited work hours, and covered areas, and only authorized personnel to enter a certain area for a limited amount of time, and so on. These are the administrative controls, and also to logistically procure and make available PPEs is also a part of administrative control. And the last in this hierarchy is, of course, the personal protective equipment. I think when we're talking about COVID currently, we are not, PPE is something so common that it's on our daily vocabulary at the moment, especially us in the medical field and so on. So PPE, although it is there in the hierarchy of control, as we realize it's at the lowest part of the hierarchy of control, meaning that if you look from a regulation point of view or scientific point of view, it means that other control measures must be there to go hand in hand with availability of PPE. So PPE alone is not sufficient to reduce any form of exposure. And at the same time, PPE is also being used while other control measures are being effectively implemented. So having said that, how effective is effective? That's another question that we have to think about and answer appropriately. All right. So let me start with what is meant by exposure. So exposure assessment, it has many ways of doing it, and it has tools and approaches. As I mentioned earlier, it can be objectively measured, and it can also be subjectively handled, depending on many other aspects like time limitation, what are the opportunities, how big is your project going to be, and what type of industry or workplaces are we doing it, how much of budget we have, and so on. As for example, if you're dealing with a large manufacturing company, then you will be, of course, you'll be having the logistics and the budget required to do a very vast or extensive exposure assessment, hiring the appropriate personnel and so on. And at the same time, you will be also seeing small and medium enterprises with limited budget, but the assessment process has to be carried out. So many factors actually influence what sort of exposure assessment that we would like to carry on. So why is exposure assessment being performed? It's being performed to estimate the risk of an employee being exposed to the occupational hazard, or the risk of an employee or employees to develop occupational hazards. So this is the basic of it. And as I mentioned earlier, what is meant by risk? It is meant by probability of developing adverse health effects due to exposure to hazardous substances. So risk is hazards times exposure. So this risk and health effects, actually the health effects actually can range from subtle changes within the human system, or even can be serious, come up with serious consequences like death and so on. And another thing that we have to remember here is when we're talking about exposures at work, these exposures can also happen out of the work environment. For example, when we're talking about, let's say, chemicals, paint, and so on. So let's say the person has some other hobby like painting at home, or doing it extensively out. Let's say it's a graffiti artist and so on. So being exposed at work is one thing. So him painting out of work is another thing. So these are the things that us as occupational health practitioners or medical practitioners have to ask in detail and find out what are they being exposed to, whether it's at work or non-work related. So why is it important? Another thing is we need to quantify how much of exposure actually happened from work. Is it compensable for occupational health related diseases? And is it truly caused by work exposure? If yes, what else need to be done at the workplace to control the risk for other employees as well? And then this comes to highlighting another factor, which is occurrence of cancer clusters at the workplace. So meaning that a few people at the workplace develop a similar type of cancer, then a certain doubt will rise. What is the actual risk that is actual hazard that these workers are being exposed to at that workplace? So we need to explore that further. So it's actually like a big puzzle that we have to put the pieces together to identify what is the exposure like, what is the risk like, and who are more vulnerable to develop the disease. So if we put these pieces together, then we will understand. So this is the particular reason why I started with the very basic for you all to understand what is meant by risk, what is meant by hazard, what is meant by exposure. So next, the basic of this another factor is we are looking into how this hazard identification, risk assessment and risk control is being done. So it is not an individual process, it is a collective process, meaning that it is being done by the employer and also input from the workers themselves. So based on that, after understanding what are the work activities that are being carried out and in consultation with the employees and also the employers' representatives, the hazards are being identified. So once the hazards are being identified, the risk assessment is being carried out. As I mentioned earlier, it depends on the place, availability, current regulations, legislations in place, and so on. So after the risk assessment is being done, then we come up with a risk control plan. And the risk control plan will identify what are the actions that can be implemented appropriately. So we don't stop at that. After the actions are being implemented, then it has to be reviewed to see how effective the actions are working or reducing the risk for the workers. So this is actually a very stepwise approach, a very basic approach, but it has a lot of input required to come up with this stepwise action. And once that is done, it is hoped that the risk can be characterized appropriately and control measures can be implemented. And it has to be very much tailored to the specific work setting, as exposure will differ from one workplace to another. So this is the basics of understanding exposure. And for you to understand occupational carcinogen exposure, the same methodology applies. So we have to go with understanding the risk, subsequently understanding the risk assessment, and then identifying the hazards, which we are going to talk about in detail later, the occupational carcinogens. Okay, so now what is meant by occupational carcinogens? As you can see on the slide here, occupational carcinogens are actually substances, radionuclide or radiation, that act as agents directly involved in causing cancer and must come into contact with the human body through environment in the workplace. So we have carcinogens, that first part of the definition, and for the second part of the definition and the first part, the occupational aspect, it must be present in the workplace environment. And occupational exposure, I have detailed this earlier, so I don't have to dwell further. And exposure assessment also, as I mentioned earlier, is actually a process or an action to measure the magnitude, the frequency, the duration of exposure to an agent, and in this context to a carcinogenic agent, along with the number and characteristics of the population exposed. So you're not looking into one person, but you're looking at a group of employees when you're talking about workplace exposure. Okay, so how do we attribute occupation as a risk for carcinogenic exposure? And as we know, cancer is actually a long-standing process that happens before it manifests as a disease. And occupational cancer, at times it takes more than 5 years to be identified. So since it's a long process, there's a long latency period, it might be difficult to properly establish a diagnosis of occupational cancer. So basically there's often an underestimation of the cause-effect chain, whether it's being caused by the work exposure or non-work exposure, and what is the link to the workplace, and is there occurrence of cancer in only one person, or is a cancer cluster happening at the workplace. So the first thing that I mentioned is the latency period, meaning from the first exposure to the onset of detectable disease. And then employees, who is handling what and what sort of exposure that the person is being exposed, at risk of, and then what sort of a job that he is doing. So when you're talking about job, there's a few ways to look into it. Let me explain from medical point of view. Let's say we are doctors, they group us as doctors, but when you're talking about doctors, we have occupational health doctors, you have anesthesiologists, you have pediatric doctors, doctors working in ICU, doctors working in the lab, and so on. So all of us are doctors, but the job title alone doesn't mean that we are being exposed to the same type of hazard. Even the job title is not going to help. For example, you're an anesthetist, but let's say you're an anesthetist working in ICU, but and then you have another anesthetist working in OT. So the exposure types who haven't worked in the ICU, but mainly stationed in the OT. So the exposure types are different, or even the scrub nurse in OT and the staff nurse in ICU. So these are the different types, groups of people who are within the same job title, staff nurse, doctors in ICU, but having different job scopes. And then we need to look further into what are the job specific aspects that they are being exposed to. They are being at risk of being exposed to substances. And as I mentioned earlier also, another thing that is making things difficult to attribute risk of developing occupational cancer is whether it's present in the general environment. For example, like consumer products, like bleaching agents or formaldehydes and so on, present in the general environment, and also in the workplace. So based on these aspects and the latency period, latency means somebody may just develop the cancer when they are retired and so on. So it's quite difficult to establish the diagnosis of occupational cancer, and is often underestimated. So if we go a bit back into the history, occupational cancer is actually quite a long-standing issue that has been discussed and studied way earlier. If we look back into the dark, during the Europe, before the Renaissance and so on, scrotal cancer was actually much discussed about in Europe. The Percival Port actually studied on scrotal cancer among those kids or teenagers doing the chimney sweeping work. I don't have the exact picture to show here, but basically if you can imagine during those days in Europe before the economical sweep came in, those who are actually cleaning up the chimneys, it's actually a very narrow sort of structure. So they needed these kids and also very scrawny thin teenagers to go up, manually clean up the soot within these chimney spaces. And Percival Port actually studied that these kids were, and young men actually, when they grow to become young men, they had a higher risk, or they were found to develop squamous cell CA of the skin. So he actually tried to demonstrate that this cancer can actually be caused by environmental carcinogen. At that time, they grouped that together, environmental and occupation. And in Germany, however, even during that time, they had this particular practice of using a head-to-toe cover from preventing the soot from entering or being in contact with the body. Why? Because they also have noted this sort of changes, but they did take the initial control measures. So basically, to sum it up, they had this sort of like ecological general studies, but they never put it way scientifically. But they did find that occupation is actually a risk of developing or occupational cancer actually. And then later there were many studies that looked into bladder cancer among dye factory workers, scrotal cancer among textile workers, among coal and oil product workers, and so on. And then only in 1934 they came up with the evidence to link asbestos and lung cancer. So this was actually a much later study that was being published, although the issue has been going on for years, but the evidential study was published in 1934. Okay, so coming back to the current times, what are we looking into when you're talking about occupational carcinogen exposure? Okay, so if we look at studies, they have compared actually middle income and also high income countries and to compare where are we heading to in terms of burden of occupational cancer. So studies have found that there's an estimated increased risk of 78% by 2030 as compared to the data in 2008 for the burden of occupational cancer to increase by 78% in the middle income countries. Another study also showed that there's estimated 50% of known human carcinogens are actually substances found principally in the workplace. And this is actually quite a shocking findings, because if you compare how much of these 50% are actually being studied, not that much actually. And another study also found that 3 to 6% of all cancers worldwide, meaning all the general cancers, are caused by exposure to carcinogens in the workplace. But unfortunately, only 5% of the global resources for cancer are being spent in these developing countries. And now if you see here, I'm having two terms, middle income countries and developing countries. Why is that so? Because in recent times, the term has been changed, but when the earlier literature came in, it was used as developing countries, but the current literatures, they use the term as middle income and high income countries. Now, if we look or we zoom in to Malaysia, what is the issues that we are facing here? Well, occupational cancer is not that generally being discussed much or being studied about. And we still have many gaps in terms of understanding what's the prevalence of exposure to these carcinogenic agents among employees in Malaysia. Often we read about chemical exposures, we know about chemical health risk assessments, but if you're looking at carcinogenic exposure and studies that are looking into prevalence, it's actually quite limited and were quite limited actually. And another thing is when people are going or employees are going to submit the claim for occupational cancer, I think we saw from the slide by Prof. Victor just now how many cases being reported to DOSH, how many cases were compensated and so on. It's not that many as compared to many other countries. So if we are looking at this, so how are we going to attribute that cancer is actually caused by occupational exposure? We do not have that much of data. And next, if we are looking at the policy aspect, developing policy aspect for occupational cancer or occupational exposure control in terms of carcinogenic exposure at work and so on, we have to come with more solid policies. But this policy development process must be appropriately supported with data. Unfortunately, if we don't have enough studies and enough data to support the policy development process, then I'm afraid the policy will not be strong and will not be effective in implementation of control measures at workplace. And how will it be adapted and regulated within the workplace? So this is why we need to study on such aspects and elements. And here I'm focusing on carcinogenic exposure. And the other thing is, if you're looking at occupational cancer or cancer in general, of course, we have the national register, we have the national database and all that. But in recent times, based on my literature review, I found that this database was not recently updated. Why is it so? Because we only have a few cancer centers in the country that is capturing this data. And there is, of course, a limitation in terms of logistics, human resources, and expertise. And even if that data is captured, it's being captured in a more general way. There's nothing looking in detail into occupation of the patient or what sort of exposure he had and further details and so on. So this essential information is actually needed to establish the diagnosis or for compensation purpose. It's actually a very long process. It has to involve many stakeholders to come up with what are the elements to capture this essential information. But having said that, if we have a very collaborated or collated network with these agencies, and if we have a proper database mechanism, then obviously this sort of information can be captured. Of course, in Malaysia, within this region, the Southeast Asian region, it can be a long process, but over time, with proper evidence, I think this can be suggested to the stakeholders. Okay, so earlier Prof. Victor spoke on occupational cancer, and I'm going to speak about carcinogen exposure. So where do we medical practitioners stand, and how much of contribution or role that we have to play? We have many hats. We wear many hats throughout the day, and we have many roles to play. And I would like to say that when we are talking about roles in all these components, for example, like in public health aspect, we can identify causes of occupational cancer. And then another important thing is to identify the trends of occupational exposure, and then what are the measures that we need to implement, and how are we going to do source control. So these are the aspects that we can look into from public health aspect. And then from occupational health aspect, we can look into what are the attributable factors for occupational exposure. And then another important element that we must understand is that these exposures are actually modifiable factors that we can actually control and manage within the workplace setting. So that is the beauty of it. Occupational exposures, they are within the environmental and occupational exposures, and these are modifiable factors. And then why is it important for us to control these exposures is, sorry, let me go back. So if we are looking into economical aspect, it is very important for us, the medical practitioners, to understand how much of disability this is causing within the society, and how much is it going to be used to identify what are the causes or basis for compensation claims. So that is another important aspect that we are looking into. And by understanding this, is also important to promote the return to work aspects, and also to promote the productivity within the workplaces. So another thing that we are looking at is individual measures, us as educators within the society. How much are we looking into to improve the awareness and to target the health education within the society, and to improve the health benefits for the employees. So basically from this we can implement behavior-based approaches. Okay, next I will speak on global occupational exposure trends to these carcinogens. So if we are talking about global occupational exposure trends, basically most of these studies were carried out within the European Union countries, and many studies were later adopted for the Latin countries and also the American countries and so on. So I will be speaking on that as well. And I'll be concentrating on a few important exposures. For example, I'll start with asbestos, the most common occupational carcinogen exposure that was studied. And if we look into past studies, I'm not going to go into very detail regarding this, but basically I'll highlight a few important studies that were being carried out. Asbestos, for example, it was based on a study in 2019. It noted that it was completely banned in 39 countries since 1983. And despite all these efforts, there are still many countries using asbestos. We still have more than 2 million tons of asbestos being consumed annually and so on. And in the paper in 2005 came up with findings that 9% of lung cancer in the world were attributable to occupational carcinogen exposure. And if we look at one of the recent studies by Prof. Lynn Frischie in 2016, her study estimated that in Australia, there's actually 14.59 million working age population, or an estimated 4.83 million cancer cases are actually due to exposures at work, including to asbestos. So asbestos was one of the elements that she studied on. And so on and so forth. There were many other studies looking into asbestos. And as recent as now in these Nordic countries, they had a very large scale study looking into what are the possible occupational environmental cancer, and they tried to link it for cholangiocarcinoma. So they did find an increased risk of exposure. So if we do a comparison and look into studies that dwell further into exposure among these developing countries and also developed countries, and they found that countries within the developing region has actually a higher risk of exposure. The population has a higher risk of exposure as compared to those in the developed country. And further studies that adopted these findings into their local settings actually found that the countries that has a better safety and health regulation and have implemented better control measures has actually a lower risk by cumulative exposure. And in Latin America countries, they actually look into asbestos exposure based on the studies being conducted in the European Union, and they refer to the data that was used by World Health Organization back in 2019, meaning that these Latin American countries, they did not conduct their own objective study, but rather referred and adopted data from the European Union countries, and they found that the population attributable factors from CAREX were being applied and adopted for these Latin American countries. They did find that certain countries were actually having a higher level of asbestos exposure as compared to some other Latin American countries. So what I'm trying to say here is we have actually a lack of data, especially in the developing countries, regarding estimation of occupational carcinogen exposure. So to sum it up regarding asbestos exposure, in current scenario, 67 countries has actually completely banned asbestos. But despite being banned, it's actually being extensively used in many countries. Why is that so? Because of the very high market demand. And it's a very good insulation material. It has very good thermal protective factor. It's actually cheaper than many other alternatives and so on. But it is causing millions of the population to be exposed to asbestos at work. And according to WHO estimates, more than 100,000 people die every year from asbestos-related lung cancer, mesothelioma, and asbestosis. And if they are looking into occupational cancer in general, 1 in 3 deaths are actually from occupational cancer. And also, if we are looking into mesothelioma, so mesothelioma has been attributed to be caused by asbestos if it's from the occupational setting. So this data also showed that the cumulative figure for this few countries, France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Switzerland, 200,000 mesothelioma deaths were expected over the period of 1995 to 2029, which is not very far from now. We are now in 2021, so 2029 is not very far. And I think after this period is over, then studies will be conducted to see how much of this exposure really happened. This was an estimate. Okay, So other carcinogens that are being studied, like the commonly studied one, are like benzene, which is mainly used in plastic production, detergent, and so on. So this is being very commonly used as a degreasing material as well. So many studies were also carried out regarding benzene, but one of the recent studies in the Canadian population, they found that the exposure is actually only 2% of the work population being exposed. But another study in Brazil, by using the Finnish method, they found that the exposure is at 8.5%. And next is about crystalline silica dust. Crystalline silica dust has this being studied extensively. So there's actually two different schools of thoughts. One said that silica exposure and lung cancer, the association is unclear, and some other studies that found that the silica exposure is being linked to lung cancer. And other studies that look into exposure to silica also found that the prevalence to silica is 2%. So now 2% may look small, but actually when we translate that into the work population, it can come up to millions. Next is diesel engine exhaust that was being studied. So I'm talking about very common exposures that were studied over a certain period of time. And of course, not so recent, but over the past few years, we have known that diesel engine exhaust has been classified as a carcinogenic agent, and studies have conducted found that as high as 20% of the working population were exposed to diesel engine exhaust at work. And we also have ionizing radiation that was being studied. So if we look at international studies, they found quite a low number of population being exposed. But coming to Malaysia, we have frontliners being exposed to radiation, and then we have those working in manufacturing and engineering sectors are also being exposed to ionizing radiation. However, if we look into which of the aspect of the regulation looking into radiation exposure, we have to further read on NADOPOD regulations for Malaysia. It do cover on protection for employees from occupational exposure to ionizing radiation, but it is not very detailed out. And in Malaysia, we also have the AELB that is looking into radiation. Okay. And I'm going to talk a bit about environmental tobacco smoke. So we did carry out study in Malaysia looking into environmental tobacco smoke exposure. So why are we saying that environmental tobacco smoke is actually a workplace exposure when it's actually something because of a personal or individual being smoking and doing that activity on a personal basis when it's not generated from the workplace. But having said that, workplace is a place where control measures can be implemented in a very systematic manner, and with proper regulations, this carcinogenic substance can be controlled. So therefore, we need to understand what is the prevalence of exposure to environmental tobacco smoke in a workplace setting so that we can come up and suggest what are the proper control measures. So studies earlier have found that exposure was there, but these studies mainly focus on hospitality sector, food industries, and so on. So not much were being done about ETS exposure within the workplace settings. So other substances that were being studied were also like heavy metals and nickel and so on, chrome platers being exposed and so on. I'm not going to talk very much in detail, but these studies can be further read through ILO websites and also the WHO websites. Another aspect of exposure that was studied is the shift work exposure. So shift work has been of a topic of discussion of late. Why is that so? Because in Malaysia, employees work in shift work system, whereas in certain European countries and in certain Nordic countries, shift work is not being applied in general. So if we look into Malaysian law, we do have the Employment Act that limits the work hours, how many hours that the employee work and so on. And the law is there. But having said that, how is it being effectively implemented within the workplace settings? That is another question. And how is it being regulated? So From scientific point of view, we know that shift work disrupts our internal biological clock. And then we have this graveyard shift pattern. That means shift work after 12 midnight, that this being studied to found to have a severe disruption to the sleep pattern, digestion, and gene involved in cancer pathways. So studies have also found out, including one that was done by itself, on the current knowledge of breast cancer among the Malaysian population, and how studies from the European or other Western countries or population can be adopted for the Asian population. Okay, so now I will be sharing a bit of information about how this exposure was studied globally. I shared some data, I shared some information how the prevalence was like. So how actually was this prevalence estimated? Actually, it started back in Europe. If we look into European Union countries, they came up with this study that looked into occupational exposure to carcinogens among 15 European Union countries, and they found that actually 32 million workers, or 23% of the employed people within this EU, are actually exposed to 139 types of carcinogens at the levels above background, meaning more than the normal level. And if that is translated, it means that 1.3 exposures per exposed worker on average, everyone like some sort of exposure being present. And this is actually not a direct measurement study. This is actually an estimation study, meaning that they use the national data and they came up with what type of job that is being carried out by these employees, and then they estimated what sort of exposure that was being present. So they did not go to the ground, they did not do a direct measurement at the workplaces, but they estimated the data based on the information available in their national database. So this is how studies were being conducted to estimate exposure. And the findings of this study, they came up to understand that certain sectors, certain work sectors, for example, like mining, manufacturing, construction, were having a higher level of exposure or higher proportion of exposure. And asbestos, of course, was one of the commonly studied substance. And next, what they did, they adjusted this exposure prevalence to the economical structure of each country, meaning that they did a general study in the beginning and then they adopted the findings to adjust for the economical structures of the respective countries, like German, Ireland. They have different structures and they adopted that. Okay, and other exposures that were being commonly studied and were substances like leading to leukemia, like benzene causing leukemia, and silica causing lung cancer and all that. So this study is also funded by World Health Organization, and it was carried way back in early 2000s. And they compared that according to the regions of the world. For example, like how different is it in Africa as compared to the European countries and Southeast Asian countries, and they tried to estimate the risk. So they also studied only the common type of cancers, not the rare types, but types of cancer with common types of exposure. As I mentioned earlier, asbestos, benzene, these are the sort of common exposures that were being studied. And if we look into these slides, I am highlighting certain types of common exposures, for example, like arsenic, asbestos, beryllium, cadmium. These are the things that you hear constantly, whereas there's so many other types of carcinogens, but these are the common types of carcinogenic exposures that you are hearing very, very commonly in the globe. And the outcome of these diseases, like cancer of the lung, cancer, leukemia, malignant mesothelioma. And as I mentioned earlier, the attributable fraction for asbestos for causing malignant mesothelioma is actually 1. So some other rare substances are being also studied worldwide. For example, like coke oven work, it was studied in China, and then exposures that were being studied were like towards polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, formaldehydes, and then who are being exposed. So these are actually the type of dirty works as reported by ILO being causing the employees or the blue collar workers to be at higher risk of being exposed. So if we look into classification, and if I can summarize it better, only certain types of carcinogens were being studied over and over again in the world. Why? Because of the use. Another thing is because of the availability of data. And the third thing is because of earlier existing studies, meaning that, okay, you studied on this and then we adopted the study and we studied. And we have to understand, if you're looking into national studies or WHO studies and all that, how much of access do they have to the workplaces for them to carry out a very detailed study? That is another aspect that they had as limitations. So what I can summarize from here is that asbestos-related cancers were the highest occupational cancer recorded, and it is also one of the most well-documented occupational cancer. But having said that, we have so many other exposures that we did not study, did not explore further, but our employees are being exposed. And in Malaysia, another worrying trend is because when we are talking about workplaces, there are many types of workplaces: manufacturing, agriculture, construction, and so on. And if we look further into, for example, like manufacturing itself, how many are large multinational corporations and how many are actually small and medium scale enterprises which has limitations for the workplace control measure implementations? And you'll be surprised that 85% of our industries are actually small and medium enterprises that has this limitation. So we have to understand what sort of this exposure, what are the limitations to implement control measures effectively. So when we're talking from research point of view, when you're talking from implementation point of view, what I can summarize here, number one, in this region, we still have insufficient relevant exposure data. Number two, we have insufficient risk data, and we do not have that many cases being reported or recorded. And hazard surveillance, as I mentioned, small and medium enterprises, the hazard surveillance can be something that is very, very difficult, more so in areas that there is lack of expertise. And why are we only studying on asbestos exposure when we have so many other exposures being present? And as from the studies, even from the European Union countries, you can look from the data that I presented earlier, that those are actually data that was estimated from available data rather than being directly counted on the ground. So these are the issues that we are facing in terms of understanding occupational carcinogen exposure. So how actually people, despite all these limitations, tried to study and assess these exposures within the workplaces. So let me enlighten you on types of methods that we can apply and use to understand the exposure based on available techniques and measurement types or tools that can able to gauge and make us understand further about these exposures. So as I mentioned earlier, we had this landmark European study that used the national data. And then we had this another study that was being carried out in Canada, also used general data. So that was another subjective method of assessment. But of reason, not so reason, but compared to the earlier studies, the one that was being carried out by Australia in 2011 was actually one of the studies that looked into understanding real issues on the ground by trying to get further information regarding the job scopes and the job tasks that were being carried out by the employees. So in 2011, there was this study conducted in Australia that used this particular active and semi-quantitative surveillance method through direct questioning of the participants. And what they did, they targeted on the job tasks and work processes to identify and determine the exposure status of the workers. So how different is this study from the earlier studies is because they did some sort of measurement instead of adapting available data. So this is what we actually think is the next milestone or the next stage in properly understanding the exposures on the ground, more so at the national level. So if we look into the assessment methods and the tools that are being available, there are many types, definitely. One is the one that many of us know the industrial hygienists do, and the methods that are being used for direct exposure assessment. And we come up with quantitative or objective findings is by direct measurements, meaning we use tool, we go to the site, we measure what is the level of certain substances at the workplace and so on. But if we are looking into studies and so on, not all workplaces have this expertise, not all workplaces allow this sort of measurements to be carried out. But for legal requirement, of course, yes, certain chemical health risk assessment, they have to conduct this sort of assessment. And then we have the job exposure metrics. But job exposure, as I mentioned earlier, the comparison or analogy between doctors and nurses and so on, we are looking into the job exposure metrics, and we are looking at the job title and not something about the specific job task being carried out. And that itself can be a limitation because you don't understand in detail what job is being carried out. And then you have the self-reported methods whereby there can be a recall bias when somebody says that they are being exposed. Let's say the person is actually trying to do some compensation claims or is actually ill because of some other aspects, but when we try to feed them with certain questions, they will say, oh yes, I am being exposed. So there's an element of recall bias when you're asking people to self-report. So that is actually a limitation, but also being used in many settings. And then we have the manual expert assessment. Manual expert assessment means people or a group of experts, they sit down and look into the data of exposure based on the available information at the workplace or at national level or at the state level. And then they pool those data to come up with appropriate information about how certain workplaces or work sectors are at a higher risk of exposure. But having said that, it has its own set of limitations. One, of course, you need many people to look and sweep through this data. Number two, it's very time consuming and it's very labor intensive. So we have this new method that was developed in Australia that I mentioned earlier. Let me go back to the earlier slide. And this is the method that I mentioned earlier, the Australian Work Exposure Study, that looked into specific job tasks, meaning the experts look into the employee's history and what are the exposure measurement records and all that, and then they come up with subjective or semi-quantitative questions that assessed in detail what are the job tasks being performed by the employees. So these questions are actually more transparent and they are more consistent, and it saves the manual time and the logistic requirements of the manual assessment method. And how did they do that? They came up with job-specific modules. So meaning within the manufacturing sector itself, for example, there are many types of jobs being performed, like wood cutting, you're doing some glue-related work, welding, painting, and so on. So each job has its own specific elements being assessed, and from that they try to estimate what sort of carcinogen exposure that this person is being likely exposed to. And they came up with a list of priority carcinogens. If you look into the IAC list, International Agency for Research on Cancer, the list is actually quite long, but when you are looking into a particular country or when you're looking at a list of carcinogens for a specific country, the number can be way lower. Like for Australia, they looked into 38 priority carcinogens. And similarly, we tried to adapt this list for Malaysia. So that is basically about how occupational carcinogen exposure is like, what is being done globally, and how the exposure is being measured. So there are, as I can sum up, you need to understand about the risk, you need to understand about the hazard, you need to understand about the exposure, you need to understand about occupational carcinogens, and then you need to know what is being done worldwide and what are the limitations in carrying out this exposure assessment. And next, on the ground, in the field, as a practitioner, what sort of measurement methods that you can use and apply to estimate the exposure. So this is the information that I'm trying to share with you all today. So next, I would like to share a bit regarding what is being done in Malaysia. As what Prof. Marzuki introduced just now, my background is on occupational cancer profiling or occupational carcinogen exposure profiling, and my doctorate study was regarding this aspect, carried out with University of Malaya and NIOSH. We tried to profile the exposures for Malaysian work population. So for a start, we looked into certain work sectors, and as I mentioned earlier, we did not study on all sort of carcinogen exposures, but we have a priority list of carcinogens that we adopted, and we looked into the existing regulation, which is the use regulation. What is the list of carcinogens being studied? And you know, the Schedule 1, the Schedule 2, and so on. Many people think only Schedule 2 is limited to carcinogenic substances and all that, which is not right. Like as you can see from my slide here, we do have exposure to radiation, non-chemical agents like shift work and all that. That, of course, being present in Malaysia, you cannot limit yourself to the use regulations alone, but you need to also look into these carcinogenic exposures to understand what is actually like, what is actually it is like in Malaysia. So we did try to profile these carcinogens, and we listed out. How did we come up with this list? Of course, we refer to the existing studies, we refer to the regulations, and we looked into the work setting, mainly from the SOCCO database. What sort of manufacturing sectors are being present in Malaysia? What sort of work being carried out? So looking into those sort of literatures and articles and studies, we came up with a list of priority carcinogens that likely to be that is being present and likely to cause exposures in Malaysia, but we have to scientifically prove and come up with appropriate findings to support the policy process. So we adopted the latest method, which was the Australian method. They used the OCCUPATIONALLY that I mentioned earlier, the semi-quantitative assessment method based on the for estimating the carcinogenic exposure, and it was actually a web-based application, and they used it in an epidemiological study setting. So in terms of profiling occupational carcinogen exposure for Malaysia, we also need to look into epidemiological setting as well. And then we came up with a few actions that we took. First is we determined the job category of the person being exposed, and then we ask questions based on the task that is being performed by the employee. And then next, the system automatically formulated the questions and answers with the pre-programmed algorithm, and came up with the risk of exposure, whether they were exposed at a high level, medium level, low level, or no exposure at all. And other than these pre-programmed algorithms, we did sift through certain data to look and did a manual review to look into what sort of exposures that can be present. For example, when you're adopting a study or a method from Australia and which do not have work settings like electric and electronic industry, and in Malaysia, in Asian countries, electric and electronic industries are very common, and they do have certain types of exposure. So you still need to do some sort of manual review of the assessment. And this method is, as I mentioned, is a web-based method. Process is automated, and we program the priority carcinogens with occupational exposure into the system, and we came up with algorithms to set up the exposure rules to identify what is the probable level and also the frequency. And how did we carry out this study? We actually call each of the respondents based on the SOCCO database. So ethically approved study, and in collaboration with SOCCO as well. And when we carried out this computer assisted telephone interview, meaning the participant on the other hand, they will be answering the questions for us, and we will be locking in the answer in the OCCUPATIONALLY system. So based on the answer being provided, we analyze the data. As I mentioned earlier, if there were some issues or certain work sectors that needed manual review, we did the review as well. And from all this input, we estimated the occupational exposure to carcinogenic agents and tried to profile what is the actual exposure, what is it like for Malaysian population. And we came up with the findings. And of course, over time, we tried to improvise the study, and then we looked into what is the possible exposure likely to be present, and subsequently we came up with recommendations for the policymakers. So this is the example of job-specific modules and task modules that we looked into. For example, job-specific modules like caretakers, ceramic, cleaner, and all that. These are like, for example, within the manufacturing sector alone, because we started looking into manufacturing sector first. And as you can see on the screen here, one element looked into the job-specific modules, and subsequently it will link to the task being performed by the employees, for example, like asbestos related works, and then they have this asbestos removal process, and then burning works, cleaning works, cutting, and so on. So these are very, very specific modules that we looked into and asked the detailed questions about. So I would like to summarize the findings of the study when we try to profile. As I mentioned, we focus on the manufacturing sector. Of course, the study can be further expanded, and if we have the proper support mechanism and grant and so on, maybe we can look into other work sectors as well. And from our study, we found that exposure, the prevalence of exposure for occupational carcinogens in Malaysia among the manufacturing employees was actually at 78.8%. As compared to the Australian study, they had 67%. So when you're talking about exposure, this included the low, medium, and high level of exposure that we further subdivided into other categories. We also, because Malaysia is a multicultural, multi-ethnic population, we also looked into the ethnic backgrounds of the population. Why is that so? Because certain control measures, for example, the language that we use to do our health awareness and health education, we have to target and do in a certain type of language and certain types of setting or understandings. So we have to ensure that our program is tailor-made or in appropriate language and so on. Sorry. And our findings also showed that respondents from the lower income group were more likely to be exposed as they were more engaged in blue-collar works like manual or semi-skilled works. And then we also looked into occupational groups based on the settings by Job Standards Malaysia, Department of Standards Malaysia. We subdivided the manufacturing sector into a few other categories, and we tried to look into these subcategories within the manufacturing sector. But however, certain group of occupations, the findings were not that significant, and we reclassified thereafter the occupational groups to come up with a more broader occupational categories. So to sum up, the prevalence among Malaysian work employees to for being exposed to occupational carcinogens at works was actually quite high in comparison to Australian population, and this provides some sort of evidence that indeed we need to study further on carcinogens at work and come up with further studies to look into what are the appropriate action and controls that can be taken. So this is first of its kind study that is being conducted in Malaysia. We looked into exposure to carcinogens, and we started with manufacturing employees. In fact, it's actually the first in Southeast Asian country. And we wanted to use the most efficient method for estimation of occupational exposure to carcinogenic agents. Now, as we can see, and as what I mentioned earlier, EU, European Union countries, they use a national data, they adapted a national data and so on. But that was a very subjective method that was looking into data alone without a proper measurement. And of course, we never go to the ground and directly measure, but we did use a semi-quantitative exposure assessment method. And then we also looked into small and medium enterprises, which make up of 80% of our manufacturing sector. And to start with, we had a very good collaboration with Social Security Organization. So we did a look into their health screening profile data, and we looked into their manufacturing employees. We had the contact numbers. We were able to call and get them to participate in our study. So these are the strengths. And having said that, we are actually in our first stages of profiling this occupational exposure to carcinogens in Malaysia. Of course, this can be further expanded to other work sectors, and we hope to do so in coming times. So I think that's about it from me. And as you can see here, these are the important reference materials that are being used for my presentation and also my study. And some of the studies are actually quite recent as 2019, but the most extensive ones were the one being carried out by European Union and also by Australia. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jasima, for the very interesting presentation.